Thank you, Mr. Jennings. Congratulations to you and to the Flores family, and of course to the couple. I don't know about Dad announcing the engagement and putting in all those little pointers for Eduardo. Seems like an unfair advantage, but you got to take it while you can get it, huh? You'll probably notice a northern twang from we speakers today being from the far north in Sherman. Mr. Burnett is on hazard duty down in Orange Beach. Being so stressful to be in such a locale to go down there and make a 5-minute update on the feast, he had to spend a week afterwards. I'm teasing him. Now, don't you tell him anything that I said. It is indeed nice to be here. It's been a while since we've been here. We have moved north since we were here last. We now live in Sherman, or not north of Sherman, actually, in Denison. So a little over an hour down here, depending on the traffic. Traffic was unfriendly on our way down. I was telling somebody as well as greeting her on the way in that we had a bone shaker trip down on Highway 75, but we made it. I have heard Mr. Peoples' sermonette before, and I was not speaking when he did, but it's interesting how things work out. Mr. Burnett shifted around the speakers in different ways. You were scheduled to have a Bible study today, as you know, and of course that changed. But as it works out, I think I'll just be picking up where right from Mr. Peoples' message and just adding to it for the sermon today. Any war is deeply troubling. You read the details. These days we can see the details, and I'm a visual person. I get more out of news, I get more out of any discussion if there's something visual to go along with it. When I saw the visuals of the war beginning in Ukraine 2 years ago in February, I was deeply shaken, not just because of the general destruction that comes along with war, but as I was looking at the pictures, I could see Western cities. I could see homes like my home. I could see shopping centers like our shopping center. I could see vehicles like our vehicles. And it was an additional shock to me to see that. I felt the same when the war began in Israel on October the 7th in 2023. Felt like I was looking at, well, it could be the USA anywhere. Let me show you what I mean. If we could begin the slides. I see the monitor, I don't see any slides. Do I have to do something? Hello to the third balcony. I was going to say the third heaven, but that would be blasphemous. We don't want to do that. I might get a response from the third heaven if I said something like that. Do we have the PowerPoint? Is it? Oh, I was looking for a monitor. Okay. Can you turn the monitor on for me, please, so I don't seem so stupid? This is the public green in the kibbutz of Alumim in Israel. It was the home of 70 settlers, men, women, and children. They were brutally attacked by Hamas on the 8th day of the feast, last great day we call it, on October the 7th. This is a pleasant street corner in the city. Looks like any street corner in suburbia USA except for the Hebrew signs on the street signs. These are homes in Alumim. We don't see the two-story or multi-story facilities, buildings that we have typically in the West, but in the kibbutz this is pretty typical. Beautiful homes, parkland. This is a playground in the backyard of somebody's home in the kibbutz. It looks like our neighborhoods, our suburbs, anywhere in the United States. This is a parking lot at this same kibbutz. These people are fleeing from the terrorist shooting. It doesn't show any shooting. It doesn't show anybody being wounded. I didn't want to do that, but you can see the vehicles there. They just look like any Western vehicle, and the people are dressed the way you'd see people dressed around here. The only difference is these people are fleeing for their lives. People, the homes, the neighborhoods, the cars, all resemble where we live. My home, my neighborhood, yours. When these wars began, I did something that probably many of you did as well. I turned to the Olivet prophecy, Matthew 24, Luke 21, and Mark 13. But I did not go there for the typical reason. Often we go there, and it is not wrong to do this, often we go there to find out where does this fit in the timeline of the fulfillment of end-time events. But that wasn't my purpose. I went there for something else. And when I did, I saw something that I hadn't seen before. That brings me to today's subject. The third question. There were two questions in the Olivet prophecy. What was the third? Let's turn to Matthew 24. Some people say there's only one question in two parts, but two questions, two question marks. Matthew 24, verse 3. Now as he, Jesus, sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately after something we will read about in a few moments, after an introductory thought. They said, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Two questions. We're familiar with these, the questions that the first few verses triggered. When will this happen? How will we know? Obviously, we want to know for the sake of preparing for it, for the sake of anticipating it. Let's pick up the first few verses here and see what came before. Jesus went out of the temple, and he departed from the temple. Some say this was him removing God's presence, the presence of the Holy Spirit, from the temple, not to return until after Christ returns. His disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. We do this all the time, don't we? We're with the same people we're normally with, family members, friends. We see something, we say, "Oh, look at that." Everybody's looking anyway, but we do that. Now, in this case, the disciples who were with Christ, they were all about the same age, apparently. Christ had been there from the time that he was a young child. He was familiar with the buildings of the temple and of Jerusalem. So it's kind of silly for the disciples to say, "Oh, look at that." But it was an awesome vista, an awesome picture. And they were moved to say, "Oh, look at that." Christ gave an unusual answer, or an unusual comment he made. Jesus said to them, "Do you not see all these things? You see these things, fellas? Yeah, that's pretty impressive. But I'll tell you what, assuredly I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down." Jesus gave a lengthy answer to their questions that followed when they said, "Tell us, when will these things be?" People have heard these answers for 2,000 years. They have read these answers. You have read them, thought about them, heard them amplified and spoken about. Have you ever zeroed in on the fact that you cannot tell when these things will be or what the signs of Christ's coming will be from what is written here? And by that I mean you cannot plot this on a calendar and say, "Oh, no, this will be in 2024, 2001, 2025, pick a date, this will be." No, you can't do that. It was expressed in such beautiful wording, such masterful wording, that anybody who heard this over the last 2,000 years, anybody who read this over the last 2,000 years would conclude, well, now could be the time. I couldn't give a message that is undated that would make everybody feel that, well, that's for now, that's immediate. We don't tend to do that. We tend to relate to, just like I did, the war in Ukraine, Russia, the war in Israel, for the sake of everybody being able to recognize it. But Christ was able to word that and word these answers in a remarkable way. I'm not going to focus on what he said as far as those signs. I want to focus on a different thing, on this third question. It's a question the disciples did not ask. And yet, as you read Matthew 24, Luke 21, Mark 13, you'll find that Christ answered an implied question, really a question that probably they should have asked. In verses 1 and 2, when Christ said, "Not one stone will be left upon another," this has nothing to do with the end time. And let me say it this way. This was fulfilled about 40 years after he said that. It was not a sign of the end. It was not an event of the end time. So why did he say it? Why did he bring this up as he begins to get into the subject, or begin to get into the answers to the disciples' two questions? Before we go deeper into this, let's bring up some more background about that kibbutz in southern Israel, because I use that example for very specific reasons. I could have used several kibbutzim. A number of areas were attacked, but this particular one, it's easy to get more background on. It was established in 1966. only 58 years ago. I say only 58 years, but if you look at the demographics of the nation of Israel, you will find that 90% of the citizens of that country are 58 years of age or less. So in other words, that kibbutz has been in existence in Israel for the lifetime of a vast majority of everybody in Israel. It was a mainstay. It was part of the background, as you were. It was a fixture in the nation. So the brutality of the shock that wiped out the people in that kibbutz, I don't mean to imply that everybody died, but a number of people were killed and wounded, and certainly all were terribly shocked. It was a shock to the entire country. That this kibbutz could be wiped out in just minutes was a shock to everyone. It had been a safe place for the people who lived there. Consider another destruction that happened not too long ago, the Francis Scott Key Bridge in Baltimore. Anybody drive over that bridge ever? Yes, at least one. I think my wife and I have driven over that bridge. We have children, grandchildren who live in that area. Wouldn't be a surprise if you have driven over it. 35,000 people every day drove over that bridge. It was a fixture in the area, but just a few weeks ago, it was knocked down. That's what it looks like, or what it looked like shortly after it was knocked down. You probably have seen the video, the news reports on it. That bridge came down in seconds. I counted, watching the video, I think I counted 4 seconds for the thing to come down. And as I understand, it'll take 4 years for it to be rebuilt. Interestingly, the governor of Maryland was born 45 years ago. The bridge was built 47 years ago. So the bridge has been a fixture in the governor's life, all of his life, and of course in the lives of many people who went over that bridge. Now, why do I mention that? What about 58 years for that kibbutz, 47 years for the bridge? Remember this scripture from John chapter 2, or John chapter 2, verse 19 and 20. Jesus said to them, "You destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Of course, he was talking about himself being resurrected from the grave, and later on in the trial against him, this was brought up and used against him. But the Jews scratched their heads, and they talked amongst themselves when he said that, and they responded, "Well, it took 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" So the temple had been in existence about as long as the Francis Scott Key Bridge. It had been a fixture in Jerusalem for longer than, not as long as the kibbutz, but about the same time as the kibbutz that was destroyed. Give you an idea of how much a shock it would be for the thing to come down. But there was more than that to the temple. Here is a model of the temple. See the comparison of size between the temple. You can look at the tiny ant-like creatures towards the bottom. Those are people. And you can look at the dwellings around the temple. That's the size of the building that Christ was talking about and the disciples were looking at as they said, "Look at all this." To which Christ said, "I'll tell you what, fellas, not a single stone is going to be left on top of another." Here's another model of Jerusalem. The circled area is a model of the temple. And again, you see the perspective. Imagine what a shock it would be for the disciples to hear this. I'm sure they talked among themselves, saying, "Well, he can't be serious. What does he mean by that? Surely this building is not going to come down." There's more to the temple, of course, than just the landmark, as huge as that would be. Turn with me back to Psalm 48, please. The temple was a fixture in the lives of all the disciples, including Christ, from the time that they were born in Israel. But it was also a part of the theology of Israel and of Judah. There are many places in the Psalms we could turn, but Psalm 48 illustrates it well. Verse 1, "Great is the Lord, and greatly to be praised in the city of our God, in his holy mountain." This is about Zion, about Jerusalem in this case, and of course the temple in it. "Beautiful in elevation, the joy of the whole earth is Mount Zion on the sides of the north, the city of the great king." This was something that would have been sung, something that would have been prayed, something that would have been discussed, perhaps on holy days. The disciples would have been very familiar with the theology of it. It wasn't just a fixture of a building that everyone was familiar with. The city of the great king, God is in her palaces. He is known as her refuge. For behold, the kings assembled. They passed by together. They saw it, and they so marveled. They were troubled, and they hastened away. Commentators aren't sure what this speaks of, but they suggest that there were kings gathered to fight against Jerusalem at one time, and they came in close enough to see the city, the buildings, and something happened that struck them with such awe that they went away, that they didn't go through with their attack. The commentators suggest that maybe it was an Elisha or Elijah. Which one was it? Elisha-like moment. Remember, Elisha was surrounded by armies, and he asked God to show his assistant what the armies were like that were the spiritual armies that were there protecting them. Perhaps God did that with these kings. We don't know. Something happened that stunned them as they were in this very special city that had been special for many hundreds of years. Verse 8, as we have heard, and so we have seen in the city of the Lord of hosts, in the city of our God, God will establish it forever. That was part of the tradition, part of the theology of Israel. And here was the Messiah, Jesus Christ, saying, you know what? Not one stone is going to be left upon another. We have thought, O God, on your loving kindness in the midst of your temple. I don't know when this particular psalm was written, but there was a temple in existence in Jerusalem at the time. So the temple is included in this instruction, this praise. According to your name, O God, so is your praise to the ends of all the earth. Your right hand is full of righteousness. Let Mount Zion rejoice. Verse 12, walk around Zion. Go all around her. Count the towers. Mark well her bulwarks. Consider her palaces, that you may tell it to the generation following. And they did. And to the next generation, and to the next, and to the next, down to the generation into which the disciples and Jesus Christ were born. This was a huge fixture, a major fixture in their lives. Jerusalem was a safe place. The temple was an absolutely safe place, guaranteed and protected by God. Turn back to Psalm 11, if you would now. Psalm 11 was published or written of in an article that we published in Discern not long ago, discussing this same thought or same concept. I was struck by this when the Worldwide Church of God came off the wheels, so to speak. Psalm 11, in the Lord I put my trust. How can you say to my soul, flee as a bird to your mountain? Now this could be David saying to himself, how can you say to yourself to flee away to the mountain? The mountain represents an institution, a fixture, a safe place. Or it could be someone taunting David and say, oh, come on, you can just run away from this because you have troubles and you have problems. It doesn't really make any difference whether it was David speaking to himself or someone speaking to him, as you will see. Look, the wicked bend their bow. There is some kind of an attack taking place. They make ready their arrow on the string, that they may shoot secretly at the upright in heart. If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? Let's look at a few different translations to bring that out a little more. The ESV, in the Lord I take refuge. How can you say to my soul, flee like a bird to your mountain? You're out hunting or you're just walking along and there's a wild bird that's maybe nesting or just doing its bird business, hanging around, and you spook it. It takes off. It's very hard to catch a bird. They fly away when they're threatened. And that's what it's talking about. When you feel threatened, fly away like a bird to your usual safe place, your mountain where you go. Behold, the wicked bend the bow. They have fitted their arrow to the string to shoot in the dark at the upright in heart. And this is worded a little differently. If the foundations are destroyed, what can the righteous do? If the foundations are destroyed. Mr. Peoples was talking about foundations being shaken. The Amplified Bible. In the Lord I take my refuge and put my trust. How can you say to me, flee like a bird to your mountain? And then it finishes off, if the foundations of a godly society are destroyed, what can the righteous do? See, a little different take on the last wording. Foundations in general, personal foundations, foundations of the entire godly society. One more, the contemporary English version. The Lord is my fortress. Don't say to me, escape. Now, whether to myself or someone else saying it to me, don't say, run away. The last statement, what can an honest person do when everything crumbles? The point is the same from all of these different translations or different wording, whatever the perspective, whether accusation or one talking to himself. They're speaking of an experience of when life comes apart, when nothing makes sense anymore, when it is a time of great stress. One more. International Children's Bible finishes off, when all that is good falls apart, what can good people do? All that is good, all that is safe, all that is stable. I believe that was part of the message that Christ was conveying to the disciples in the Olivet prophecy. The destruction of Jerusalem and the temple was obviously such an event that would shake them. And when it happened, 40 years or so later, it did shake them and all other Christians, because this was not supposed to happen. Jerusalem was supposed to be God's city. Indeed it was. Indeed it is. The temple was supposed to be God's building, and indeed it was. Was it a warning, both to the disciples and to later Christians who became disciples with them, and to us, about the foundations crumbling at different times? I think it was. See if you agree with me as we go through this. This is the third question. What should I do when my foundation crumbles? Not just when will it crumble, not what are the signs of it crumbling, but what do I do when it crumbles? You know when it crumbles. Your stomach drops down like an elevator going super fast. You're shaken to your toes. You want to sleep. You don't want to eat. You don't want to talk to anyone. You're shaken. Whether it is truly the beginning of the end of the age or personal crisis, what should you do when the foundations crumble? Foundations of your life, the foundations of the godly society around you, foundations of your health, foundations of your family. In the words of the International Children's Bible, when all that is good falls apart, what can you do? What can a good person do? I believe Christ answered this question in detail, even though the disciples did not directly ask it. You can look for specific statements in here, and you might put it together differently, but I came up with 12 different expressions of what Christ said about what to do. That's what I want to look at for the majority of the sermon time. Number one, as he sat on the Mount of Olives, and this will be for the most part from the ESV, disciples came to him privately after he had said this about the stones being not left one on another. Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Jesus answered them and said, see that no one leads you astray or deceives you, as the New King James says. That's statement number one. See that no one deceives you. Mark 13, the parallel from Mark's gospel, says, be on your guard for this section. Be on your guard. Jesus continued in Matthew 24, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. Don't you think you'd be solidified, you'd be more stable in times of crisis? No, actually, in reality, Christ was warning, you are going to be vulnerable to someone coming along and pulling you away from the faith when, whatever you fill in the blank with, your foundation crumbles. Be careful that you are not led astray. When your foundations crumble, you are likely weakened physically, mentally, and spiritually. You might be angry. You might be depressed. You might be discouraged. But you are especially vulnerable to being deceived when your foundations crumble. As I was preparing the sermon, I thought back over my life and wondered what would I say were illustrations of when my foundations crumbled. One I would put down is a very 60-second moment in time. It's not much of a shake, is it? Not much of a foundation. But actually, it was quite a shake. It was the 1971 San Fernando Valley earthquake in Southern California. I was living on Ambassador College property at the time, a senior in Ambassador College, and the dormitory in which I was living rattled so that every chimney came down. Nothing burned in the building, but we didn't know that it was not smoke. The building filled with dust. Turns out it was mortar from all of the chimneys coming down. The bunk beds in the room where I was, 6 in the morning, yes, I was still in bed. Shame on me, Ambassador College, I wasn't up at 4. But I still remember the bunk beds swung back and then smashed into each other, over and over and over for 60 seconds. The nearest thing I could describe it to would be, you know, when you're in a chair and your chair goes over backwards, and your mother always said, don't lean back in your chair, but you did anyway, and it began to fall, and you knew it was going to fall, and you flapped your wings, you couldn't stop it. Well, that's the way it felt for 60 seconds, though, and there was no stop. One of my friends was outside and going for an early morning walk, much more ambassador than I was, out there at 6 in the morning. And he said the ground was going like a rope. You can take the end of a rope and whip it and make a wave go through it. The ground was going like that. What's the Latin terra firma? Terra, the earth, is supposed to be firma. It was firma not. It was a time of great shaking, that which was supposed to be the foundation, where you could go where it was stable. Oh, I got to get out of this building because it's shaking. Where do I go? I go outside. The ground is shaking. It was a time when the foundations were crumbling. A couple other times in my life when the foundations were shaken was when 2 of my children nearly died. These were separate occasions. One nearly died from a birth defect. He had what the doctors eventually diagnosed as an incarcerated hernia. A section of his bowel dropped through an opening in the stomach wall and pinched off the bowel, and had he not had emergency surgery, he would have died in a few hours from that. Another was a son who had whooping cough. He was over it, but he had a relapse, and he had a spell of coughing. He aspirated, and he choked. And he turned blue, had to get the ambulance, rush him to the hospital. He was in emergency when I got there. I was brought from home. He was, well, the nurses said, why doesn't he breathe? As I walked in, why isn't he breathing? And he just looked like he was dead. I anointed him, went right by the nurses and anointed him, and in a matter of moments he was up and running around the floor. It was an inspiring circumstance, but I'll tell you, the ground was crumbling until that time. I want to say as I go through these examples that I hope this does not cause unpleasant memories for any of you as you are reminded of things that have happened in your lives, because the foundations crumble. These things do happen to people. As Mr. Peoples was saying, God allows them for good reason. There are things that God does with us that he would not be able to do otherwise if these things did not happen. I remember one time a pastor was giving a sermon on Revelation, and my youngest son said afterwards, well, that was really upsetting. And it is, but these things are going to happen, and to know about them beforehand and to know what God is saying, what Christ is saying to us through this chapter is actually very comforting and very helpful, as you will see as we put all of this together. Another time that really shook me was the sudden death of my father. Obviously, the death of a parent would be a time of shaking at any time, but my dad was only 60 years of age. He was having surgery. He wasn't expected to die. It was supposed to be relatively routine, but he died. I was in my 30s. I had said the last words over a number of people at the time. I was a pastor, but I was just terribly shaken when he died. My grandparents were still alive, and I can remember being in the living room of my grandparents' home and talking to my grandpa. Just the 2 of us were there after the funeral, and I was ready to leave with my family and go back to Montreal, where I was living at the time. And I tried to find words of comfort from my granddad. I said, well, Grandpa, you've probably seen a lot of death. A lot of your friends have died. He was 80-something at the time, 84 probably. He said, Cecil, there hasn't been a death in the close family in 35 years. So that's a wonderful blessing, but a wonderful shock when somebody died. I was moved to tears when I got the call from my wife saying that my father had died in surgery, but I was, had the stiff upper lip for the sake of my family when I was with them. But after that exchange with my grandpa, and when I was driving home with my family, I just broke down in tears right in front of everybody. It was just overwhelming. My foundations were done. Another time that happened in my life, probably happened in many of your lives as well, was in 1994 when the foundation of the Worldwide Church of God crumbled. I grew up in a Protestant faith. I was called into the church when I was in my late teens, and it was the mountain. I mean, the church was the mountain. There was the truth. I saw the Sabbath. It's the Sabbath. It's not Sunday. It's, the holy days. It's not Easter, Christmas, and Halloween. And it's clean and unclean meats. It's not, pork and all that stuff. I was really excited, and I saw a prophecy for the future, and boy, this was the place to be. And I went to Ambassador College, and I worked for the church, and then I was called into the field ministry, and I pastored churches for 20 years. And then this church, which was God's church, became the Baptist church that I grew up in. And I was shaken to my foundations, as were many, many other people. A few months after that, my wife of 25 years divorced me. A few months after that, the Worldwide Church of God, let me back up, I'm getting the timing wrong. The Worldwide Church of God retired me for health reasons first in 1994. A few months after that is when it all came apart theologically. And then a few months after the church came apart is when my wife divorced me. It shook me enough that it still shakes me to explain it, I guess. But you can imagine how difficult that would be. I had 5 dependent children still at the time when I was no longer able to work. And the church, which was supposedly supporting me, had pulled its support. There have been other times. I only mention a few things like that just to show you that I'm not standing here as someone who is untouched by the challenges of life. Let's go on to number 2 point from what Christ said about how we deal with these things. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. These are but the beginning of birth pains. This is perhaps one of the most difficult pieces of instructions that Christ could probably give, one of the most difficult ones to follow. There will be nation against nation. You live in southern Israel, Gaza is going to attack you, 1,200 people are going to be butchered in hideous ways. Do not be alarmed. Think back to the times of World War. Nation is going to rise against nation. The entire world is going to be engaged. Tens of millions of people will die. Do not panic, as one translation says. Do not be anxious. Do not be terrified, as other translations say. Your safest place is going to crumble. I remember very well a family that I knew and served in central Canada who lived through the Blitz in World War II in London. Talked about the bombs coming down and how that changed their lives. They moved to Canada to escape the war after World War I, and they got in the Great Depression, the Dust Bowl. They moved back to London and got in World War II. Number 3, Luke 21, now in the sequence here, I'll bring this in. But before all this, they will lay hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and the prisons, synagogues for the sake of a religious court, as it were, I guess. And then you'll be in prison. You'll be brought before kings and governors for my name's sake. This will be your opportunity to bear witness. Settle it, therefore, in your minds not to meditate beforehand how to answer. For I will give you a mouth and wisdom which none of your adversaries will be able to withstand or contradict. Again, this is a difficult instruction to listen to. You're going to be arrested. You're going to be put in prison, falsely accused and falsely imprisoned. Don't worry about it. Well, wow, I am worried about it. I see what's happening in the Justice Department of the United States even now, and it is cause for concern. But the instruction here is settle it in your minds not to work out an answer beforehand. I do not take this as advice to fail to think ahead. We're always supposed to think ahead. I don't take it as advice to fail to plan. We're supposed to plan out our lives rather than just let life happen. But I take it as advice that there will be times when we aren't able to script exactly what we'll say and exactly how things will work out. That's what happens when the foundation crumbles. Well, we used to take this street. The bridge is out. We can't go that way anymore. This used to be my home. It is no longer. I can't go there anymore. I used to be able to talk with Dad. He's not here anymore. It is a caution from Christ that there will be times when you must depend totally on God to give you the words that you need, the direction that you need, the focus that you need, because you will be so shaken by life. Not just by the times of the end, but by life. Number 4, Matthew 24, back here now, verses 10 through 13. Then many will fall away and betray one another and hate one another. This sadly speaks to people leaving the faith. False prophets will arise and lead many astray, and because lawlessness will be increased, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved. As difficult as it is to be firm, to endure, that's what Christ is telling us to do, to endure through all that is going to happen. It is a tendency to withdraw. Mr. People spoke of this. It is a tendency to withdraw from others when you have been offended, to be angry when you have been betrayed, to become unloving when you are hurting. Sometimes we switch to the negative just because we perceive that we have been betrayed. We think we have been hurt. And maybe nothing was done intentionally, but still the reaction comes from within. That's what we tend to do. And Christ said, when the foundations crumble and you're tempted to withdraw, to become angry, to become unloving, you need to hang in there and endure through it all. Let's look at some different translations on this. The Amplified says, the one who endures and bears up under suffering to the end will be saved. Complete Jewish Bible, whoever holds out till the end will be delivered. And then the Contemporary English, but if you keep on being faithful right to the end, you will be saved. Again, one might say, well, that's pretty sobering to hear all these things, but look at the positive side. If you hang on, you will make it. When the foundations crumble, you're overwhelmed with the sense of, will life ever be normal again? But the answer here through Christ is yes, it will be. Yes, it does work out in the end. Mr. Armstrong used to say, I read the end of the book, and we win. And Christ was encouraging the disciples to think in those terms. Would it be better if the people in the kibbutz at Al-Yumin had not been told that the terrorists were coming? Because look what they did. It was horrifying. Or wouldn't it have been better if they had known the terrorists were coming and what they needed to do when they did come? That's what Christ was doing through these 12 points, telling the disciples, telling us what to do when the foundations crumble. Number 5, and this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. Some have said through the years, as the foundations have crumbled at different times in different church organizations, that must be it. There's no longer a need, no longer a way to preach the gospel. It's time to circle the wagons, as it were, and just wait until the end. Now, I know Christ did not say right here, you will preach the gospel, but in Mark 13, and I put this up because in the parallel chapter it does say it more dogmatically, the gospel must be proclaimed. So in the midst of all of the foundations crumbling, whether it's personal, whether it's institutional, whether it's a godly society, whether it's the society in general around us, which certainly is crumbling, the gospel must be preached. There is never a time, regardless of what is happening to us personally or in the world, there is never a time when we say the work is over. We don't put the pencil down, to put it in terms of the teacher with the, writing out the exam answers. No pencils down until Jesus Christ himself says that's the end. And it's time no longer to do the work. No matter what happens to our safe place, and that happened in the Worldwide Church of God when it came apart and there was no longer an organization to do a work. Some people would say, well, why were there so many Church of God groups? Why leave the Worldwide Church of God? Because of this. because the gospel must be preached. And it was not possible anymore in that particular setup. And the Worldwide Church of God came apart slowly, came apart over here at one time and over there at another time. That led to the formation of a number of different Church of God groups, mostly, for the most part, forming for the sake of having a structure to be able to continue to preach the gospel. Number 6. When you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Well, what does that mean? I don't know. I don't see it standing in the holy place yet. There is something about this that we will not understand until the time. And that's just something to keep in mind. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one who is on the housetop not go down to take what is in his house. Let the one who is in the field not turn back to take his cloak. Well, again, does this mean you shouldn't ever pack if you're going to have to leave something? Do you not do any planning when your foundation crumbles and you have to move from one stage of life to another? I don't take it that way. I take it this way, a warning that survival of any crisis, personal or major, societal or godly society, the survival of any crisis is in God's hands. That is, it won't come about because you have it figured out, I have it figured out, and we have the survival plan already laid. It's a tornado cellar, it's a cache of gold in the backyard, it's our savings stuffed into our mattress, it's a stockpile of food, it's a cabin in Montana. You know, a lot of different things people have done. Some people have taken desert survival training and gotten passports for Jordan, anticipating they're going to go to a place of safety. All kinds of things have been done so that people would have everything worked out in advance. It's natural, as Mr. Peoples again said, to take control of your life when it seems to be coming apart. And there could be some good that comes out of a crisis. Maybe we do need to tighten down the hatches a little bit, and there are things that we can do. And it's not wrong to have food stored ahead. And if you want to go to Jordan, get a passport. But to count on those things as the way to see you through a time of crumble, especially at the end of the age, but of many major things that can happen and do happen between now and then, be forewarned. Your survival will ultimately be in God's hands, not in how you invest your gold. Number 7, pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on the Sabbath. The easy-to-read translation. Yes, there really is a translation by that title. You must pray to God about this time when you have to run away quickly. Pray that this time of trouble will not happen in winter. Pray that it will not happen on your day of rest. Now, you better hope that the Christians who are in a different hemisphere aren't as strong as you when you're praying that your flight would not be in winter. Because you see, they'll pray that theirs won't be in winter, and it turns out to be winter for you and summer for them. Now, Christ knew that. I just say that to point out the fact that this is speaking of more than avoiding making travel plans in winter or on the Sabbath. These are times when it would be very difficult to travel. And I take Christ's advice, and frankly, I was reminded of something that I hadn't been doing often, to pray in advance that when crises come, that God would see that when crises come, we are able to handle them. Now, I'll pause here. We're over halfway through. I'll pause here to say that if you stop to think about all these things we've been through and the things we're about to go through, I think you'll see that these are not a list of things to do when a crisis occurs. Break glass in case of fire. Rather, they're a list of things to do mentally and spiritually, some physical preparation, all the time. Mr. Peoples again mentioned this. When you stand in a time of trouble, well, the best is when you have been standing before that time of trouble comes. One minister said one time that some people were spiritual roadkill. They had been Christians, been members of God's church, and when the vehicle of the church crashed, they were crushed under it, and they were lost spiritually. Well, People did wander. Some people have wandered. I'm not their judge. Thank God some people have come back at that time. Other people have died, and maybe they'll have a time in the future, and maybe they weren't called. We hope that. But the point is, you have to be prepared in advance so that these things do not shake you and take you away. Number 8. Then if anyone says to you, look, here is the Christ, there he is, do not believe it. This is it ties in with the first point. False Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders so as to lead astray, if possible, even the elect. So if they say to you, look, he's in the wilderness, don't go out. If they say, look, he is in the inner rooms, don't believe it. Where the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Woo, that's kind of a gruesome picture, isn't it? I don't know where the body is, look for the vultures. I don't know where the church is, look for the vultures. Well, that's a very graphic way to say it. But know where the body is part of the instruction. Don't believe it when someone, some force, something comes along to tempt you to say, here's where you need to go for stability and security. A lot of people have been taken away. I don't want to overstate that. Some people have been taken away from the faith because when crisis came, someone or something came along to offer. It could have been a diet, it could have been a different church organization, it could have been a group that had more music, it could have been a group that had a speaker that was liked better, it could have been a group that didn't have a speaker that somebody didn't like as much, etc. But when the foundations crumbled, these people were vulnerable to a different Christ, a different Savior. Oh, I'll do this and then everything will be okay. Again, I don't take it as a prohibition against having good sense, studying, learning, getting advice, but I take it as a prohibition against jumping off one track and going on a totally different one. You have to know where your Savior is. Where is the trunk of the tree? I'd say it another way, stay with the church. And that's not always easy, is it? Mr. Armstrong used to say, hug the trunk of the tree. Well, I was doing that in 1994, and the tree moved. But then I found that it wasn't just the tree. Of course, Christ was the one who planted the forest, so to speak, and was managing it. And we found the church. Number 9. From the fig tree, learn this lesson. As soon as the branches becomes tender and puts out leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see all these things, know that he is near, even at the very gates. We rejoiced seeing the trees put out their buds and then their early flowers and then eventually their light-colored leaves or multicolored leaves and then eventually the full leaf as springtime came. It's a very positive thing. Christ is saying here that we should know the signs of the end. Yes, he did have many messages in Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21. No, you cannot plot on a calendar exactly when Christ will return, but when he does return, you're going to be able to go, that's right. That's how the puzzle pieces fit together. Now I see it. He did say this and that and the other thing, and now I see it does fit together. And we are supposed to be familiar with the signs that he gave. Number 10. Therefore, stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. Now, even though people use this to try to plot the specific time, he said this, you do not know. People don't think. But know this, that if the master of the house had known what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake. It would not have let his house be broken into. Mark's counterpart, parallel message. Therefore, stay awake, for you do not know when the master of the house will come, lest he come suddenly and find you asleep. What I say to you all, stay awake. So that's the simple instruction. Stay awake. Frankly, it is tempting to want to sleep when you are depressed, when your foundations crumble, when you're no longer able to do what was not just routine for you, but what was comforting, what defined life for you, and suddenly it no longer does. You just want to withdraw. How many of you do not have a cell phone? I don't just mean with you. How many of you do not own a cell phone? I don't see a single hand. I am so old that I remember when people did not drive along in their cars with their cell phones, and children did not walk along the street with their cell phones going like this. And we did not live by smartphones. We are tied to technology. We have withdrawn from life even unconsciously. And I don't mean to criticize and say there's something wrong with using a smartphone or a computer or a television set. I just want to make the point that we want to be careful to stay awake, because Christ said to do that. We can go to sleep because we are distracted from other things. We can go to sleep because we are depressed and we want to withdraw. I've noticed in general that many people are unaware of what's going on in the community, in the country, in the world. I probably, many of you do the same thing. I dig through different news outlets to find out what's going on in Europe, in Ukraine, in the Middle East, in the Far East, in South America, Latin America, because American news is so absorbed with polls and court trials and memes and sporting events. And, you know, all those things are interesting. Well, maybe not all of them. But in general, as I say, I've noticed that people tend not to be as alert as maybe people once were. And we live in a time when it's possible to know more about many things than any other time in human history. And we probably know less. And Christ said, as the end approaches and as crises come in our lives, stay awake. Especially, don't allow yourself to be put to sleep. Don't drift off because you are depressed when the foundations crumble. None of these things is easy. I don't think Christ meant to imply to the disciples, hey, you do all this is the easy way. Stones are going to fall, but you go this way, they won't fall on you. I don't think that was what he was implying at all. Number 11, Matthew 24, verse 44, therefore you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour that you do not expect. Be prepared is the way other translations put this. I separated this from know the signs and stay awake because it emphasizes something more, I believe. You might have memorized the signs of the end that Jesus gave. You might be able to just tick them right off, a whole lot better than I could. You might be a watcher of all world news from weather to warfare. There are websites that are dedicated to fulfilled prophecy events. And I don't mean Church of God websites, I mean evangelical Christian websites. Back when Mr. Herbert Armstrong was doing his early broadcasting in the 30s and then on into the 50s when he began in television, there were not very many prophetic messengers out there. Now there are many of them. And I know some in the church glom on to these websites. It's okay, you can get information, but I have to say, be careful, because there's more than just knowing the signs and staying awake to where these signs are being fulfilled. There is also being prepared personally, spiritually. You can know the signs, you can recite them, you can tick off a quick summary of today's news and not be prepared spiritually, can you? That is intimate, that is personal. The church may be going in a certain direction. Most of the people in the church may be going in a certain direction. Your spouse may be going in a certain direction, and you not, depending on what you personally are doing. Be prepared. And number 12, who then is faithful, and who is the faithful and wise servant whom his master has set over his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. The complete Jewish Bible. It will go well with that servant if he is found doing his job when the master comes. And we come back to a sense of personal responsibility. Being prepared spiritually is one thing. Doing spiritually is another. Your heart, your character, your belief, your faith may be sound. Are you putting it into practice? And are you fulfilling your responsibility within the body? We can read in 1 Corinthians 12, Christ places members in the body as it pleases him. Should you be in this body? Should you be in this body every Sabbath? Health permitting, unless you happen to be traveling. People drift from those things, and they fail to realize some of the responsibilities that we need to be following for the sake of being able to deal with our personal crises as well as world crises and church crises. We need to be fulfilling our responsibility. As I reflect back over my life, I have to admit that that changes. When God called me, I was a teenager, and I was set on, I want to go to Ambassador College. My father wrote to the college and forbade them. I was not yet 18. He said, I forbid you to accept my son. So they deferred for a year. And then past 18, I was able to get in. My focus was on, I wanted to go to Ambassador College. And then my focus was, I wanted to be a part of the work before the end came. You know when that was in the 70s, the end came. It didn't really, I'm kidding. But then I had the opportunity to work for the church at headquarters for a few years. I did, and my focus was that. And then I was transferred to the field ministry, and my focus was on pastoring churches for 20 years. And then my health debilitated so, the church administration decided I was no longer able to fulfill that responsibility, and I was retired. As I said earlier, I had 5 dependent children still. I didn't know what I was going to do for support. It was a challenging time, but my responsibility changed. And then I began to do different things in earning a living and different things in serving the church, and so on it goes with my personal story. But life changes when you're single, when you're married, when you have little children, when you have growing children, when you have teenagers, when you have grown children, when you have grandchildren, when your spouse dies, when you grow old. Life changes, and your responsibilities may change, but you always have responsibilities. You never reach a place at which you can say, I'm done. I'm just kicking back here. I'm filling in time until Christ returns. You'll be caught off guard if you do that when the crises come. You need to be so doing. As long as life continues, we never reach the place of I'm done. So the third question, what should I do when my foundation crumbles? I see a theme running through what Christ said in the Olivet prophecy. Our physical safe places will be shaken at times. He started with a prophecy about something that had nothing to do with the end of the age, the destruction of the temple. The general prophecy shows that there will be a once in human history shaking of every foundation that exists. All that we know in this world, economic, political, religious, will be shaken. And so it will happen in our lives. There are specific things that we can and we must do in order to survive them and, frankly, to help each other survive them. Let's close by reading one more psalm. Go back to the 40s, 46 this time. There are a number of places where we could read these promises, but this particular psalm, I think, says it very well, and this is where I'd like to conclude. Psalm 46, God is our refuge and strength. Did God promise that Jerusalem would always be? Yes, he did. That the temple would always be? Yes, he did. But he didn't mean that physical Jerusalem would always be and the physical temple would always be. His perspective and his vista went beyond that to the spiritual. And though the physical buildings came down, God did not. He was a refuge for the early disciples, for the early church, and he is for us. He is a very present help in time of trouble when the foundations crumble. Therefore, we will not fear, even though the earth be removed, and it does move sometimes, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea, though the waters roar and be troubled, though the mountains shake with its swelling. There is a river whose streams shall make glad the city of God, the holy place of the tabernacle of the Most High. God is in the midst of her, the spiritual city of God. As he was when Christ spoke, even though the disciples did not understand the spiritual dimension. The holy place, God is in the midst of her, she shall not be moved. God shall help her just at the break of dawn, just at the time of necessity, of rescue. The nations raged. The kingdoms were moved. There will be, there have been, war. He uttered his voice, and the earth melted. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. That's what Christ was saying to those disciples and what Christ is saying to us. Come, behold the works of the Lord, who has made desolations in the earth. He makes wars to cease to the end of the earth. And God speed that day when he will do that. He breaks the bow that's used to shoot arrows at people. He will shoot down the missiles that are used to take life. He cuts the spear in two. He burns the chariot, the tank, the submarine, the battle cruiser. He burns the chariot in the fire. Be still. Hard to do that when the foundations are crumbling. But that's God's advice. Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth that is coming. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. He is our safe place. There is a safe place for us, always.